This podcast is a member of WGPRN, WildGamesProductions.com.
Hi, this is Dan Glenn, and we're talking to Bill Owen, formerly of Judges Guild. And
Hello.
Hello, Bill, one of the movers and shakers in the early world of role-playing games. And we have a few questions from some of the people from the web, from some of the boards. I've got one here. Besides City State of the Invincible Overlord, Tarantus, World Emperor, were there any other plans to make any other city-states around that world?
Not that I know of. I was only really in Judges Guild for the first 2 years. Mm-hmm. And during that time, we started to get ready on the World Emperor. Mm-hmm. And by the time I left, it was pretty much underway with the outside author. And I would stop by and see him occasionally. Mm-hmm. But other than that, I didn't have any involvement.
Okay. Liz? Oh.
Okay. This is another question from Thorkhammer on Dragon's Foot. And he was wanting to know, why was there so much concern created about rolling up female characters? In his opinion, he thought the system seemed a bit weird and even a little sexist.
Yeah, I don't know if the word sexist was common back then, but maybe it was. You got to remember back in the early 70s when this was started, things were different, and politically correct terminology and so on that, masked true feelings and so on didn't exist then as much. And anyway, I remember Bob saying at some point that it hit him that anybody might buy this. And since most of the people who were playing the game then were in their 20s to maybe, Bob was like 32 or something, it didn't seem like an issue. And so once it occurred to him that, preteens and this sort of thing might be buying this game, he had to tone down the, racy content. Uh-huh. So that it would sound racy up front, but then when you go in the store, it was just kind of foolish. Now, obviously, people wouldn't, necessarily have to go with that, but you didn't want to have parents yelling at you and stuff.
Oh yeah.
On the same note, about the Amazon class, or I guess there were listings for both Amazons and barbarians among the fighting men class. Was the mixing intentional? There really seemed to be no difference between them except culturally. Did Judges Guild ever intend to develop full-blown classes for the Amazon or the barbarian?
At the beginning, I really sort of thought we were doing a product mainly for D&D. Mm-hmm. And Bob, who was always very visionary and moving way out there, dragging me behind, probably had all sorts of ideas and plans that he didn't necessarily tell me about right away because he was just sort of thinking about them. And so it's possible that he intended to, develop more. But in my way of thinking, they were two different listings. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't a lot of distinction. It was a distinction without a difference.
Mike, did you have some questions from John Gaunt?
John Gaunt over at Dragon's Foot had a question, and as I bought a copy of this too, I'd like to know. A couple of years ago, I think it was '08, you published Bob and Bill, A Cautionary Tale.
Yes.
Which I got a copy of. Great book, by the way.
Thank you.
We were both kind of interested if there would be any additions you would make to it if you were publishing it again today. Something,
well,
addendums,
sure.
Rada.
Yeah, there's been things that pop up, and I've intended to sort of expand it into a coffee table book. And the reasoning behind the coffee table book is it had more room to ramble, so that we could include some things like the original No Name City, which was the city-state before it got its name, and it was set in Middle Earth, but that, of course, Bob realized that Tolkien family might be against that without a big royalty. And anyway, the one thing that I could mention right away to correct the record is that I thought that we had the first D&D game in my apartment, and it turns out that it was really Mark Summerlot who put that on. And it explains why I remember so little about the game per se, other than that it was, exciting and fun and everything. But I do remember the part that I did write about, that Bob kind of quietly walks up and said, "Can I borrow the game for a while?" And I don't think I ever saw it again, but it was the best investment, that I ever put into fantasy gaming.
Well, good DMs are hard to find.
Yeah.
Yep. And really, that was roughly in September, let's say, because Lake Geneva Con was in August. And so before the end of that month, I'm sure that we were heading out to Bob's house, Summerlot and I, and Bob had drawn up just an incredible amount of stuff with almost nothing to go by, which, of course, is the way it was back then. And so he set the tone right away. He was the main judge, as we referred to them, rather than the dungeon master. And anyway, it was great.
Cool. Well, if you put out that coffee table book, I'll certainly buy one or two.
Well, thank you. It's expensive, not because I'm marking it up a lot, but to do that kind of like one-off publishing. But it's going to be 80 pages this time, and I'm going to just have to fill space with maps and stuff that I think people will actually like to see anyway. Because sometimes a map as big as we produced is pretty inconvenient to just sort of look through, and seeing it on the page will be more convenient, and you can sort of sit in a chair rather than hunched over a table.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So those maps, they still blow people away. You pull them out and go, "Oh my God, this is great."
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of blew the market away at the time, and I think we were just trying to sort of get its attention, and we could have probably done something a little smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in some ways, I think because we started off with such an oversized bang, it was hard to follow up on that.
Keep the momentum?
Well, first of all, I think, Bob really got burnt out that fall of 76. And he had to sort of regroup, and it would have been smarter in retrospect. But see, these are all, it's easy hindsight, but we didn't want to leave anything to chance, so we, pulled a giant cannon up instead of just, BB gun.
Good idea.
And the industry at the time, nobody was really putting out campaigns or modules, right?
No, in fact, the only other campaign that I ever really saw was Arneson's, and it seemed to be kind of slightly disorganized. I don't want to put it down because, I got it kind of in the mail, so to speak, and had to figure out how to turn it into something that looked like what we would do. And it was just uncommon. You just didn't have stuff like that. And I don't think people had the incredible vision that Bob had to have not just, one Wilderlands map, but a world full, or at least a hemisphere full of Wilderlands maps.
Yeah.
And then, other planets and stuff.
I think this hobby was fortunate because usually there's a lot of hobbies where there's like maybe one or two just visionary geniuses, and this hobby's like, half a dozen? And
I
I
suppose
mean,
so.
you and Bob and Gary and Dave, we got an embarrassment of riches in that department.
Well, and
So
I have to correct something because I was more of a supporter than I was a visionary. Because see, I was more of an accessories person. I would make up the combat charts or the little rule systems. We'd test all sorts of crazy things. And people keep asking me about various magic systems that Bob has hinted at in his writing. And the best I can do is go to Summerlot because he's probably the only one who's played D&D, other than Bob, that I know, in our manner, you might say, continuously since about 1974, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah. So you did do the work on First Fantasy Campaign?
Yes, it was kind of delegated to me, which, wasn't a lot of fun. Because, I respected Arneson greatly, but to get someone else's materials that appeared to be in places half done or whatever, was both intimidating and kind of frustrating because, anything I added to it at that point would probably be, crappy. And whatever he, did, it's easy to say, well, of course this is what this was supposed to be, And yet he really didn't strike me that way. He was very easygoing about the whole thing. And since he was out of TSR at that point, see, when we first went to TSR, it's Arneson that we met. We didn't see anyone else there. So we at least had a slight relationship with him. But then we were back on the road again right after we popped in. And that's something else that I left out of my book, if you want me to add to it, is that I thought we went to TSR in the spring and then spent the summer getting ready for the con. And the fact is that we didn't even go to TSR until about, I think, July 18th. And the con was just, a month later.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what's happened there is that my, increasingly 56-year-old brain, okay, which is what it is now, kept pushing back in my memory when we must have gone, because it would have been only more prudent and reasonable to have gone earlier to find out whether it was worth doing all this work. We actually started doing a lot of work before we ever went and asked for permission, and if they had not given it, then the whole thing would have been like, oh well. And,
But prudent and reasonable doesn't really work at that age, right?
Yeah, at 21 or whatever it was when I was then, I was kind of all charged up and thought that was just, what you do. And later they did ask for a royalty, so, that kind of like, whoa, we hadn't planned on that. So, but.
Mike? Mike, you got the next? Well, have you been working with Bob Jr. in any capacity?
Not particularly. I'm, always eager to see what he's got going, and if he's got any, question or issue at all, I'm, glad to help out. But the reality is that I really haven't been involved in fantasy games since about 1979, and so, I have these notions every so often to produce a game that might be slightly related, not so much to role-playing per se, but more of a board game, you might say. And it's probably been produced 6 times by now, and I wouldn't know any better, It's just I just haven't found it yet. So you end up with ideas for things. I was going to do the simple fantasy game, which I'm sure has been done to death by several different publishers by now, because there's 2 directions the game can go. It can just keep adding complexity and, stuff forever, or it can be fairly simplistic and maybe a little bit more accessible to people. And then they, maybe graduate to other systems perhaps. And that's something Bob wanted me to produce because we talked about it. But the other thing was the Civil War game, because you got to remember we were war gamers mainly. Right. And then and that thing got ready for publication so many times, but I wasn't happy with it. So when I'm working on my own product, it's pretty easy to just put it off and put it aside. But fortunately, during the first 2 years, I would get people's products to work on, and they were, usually a little more developed than Arneson's initial, submission was. And so we'd get them in the pipeline and move them on. So I really was more the publisher, and Bob was the author.
Okay.
Asking about the royalties issue, was there any other, oopsies that Judges Guild got into regarding, permission for various product, other than the TSR stuff?
Initially, the TSR stuff was pretty much all I worked on. I guess, Bob went on to do Traveler and different things after, I was gone. But in some ways, I probably acted as a brake on his, expansion. And I was wanting to focus primarily on D&D. I perceive that to be the core fantasy product that, every other fantasy system, or whatever you want to call it, out there would represent 30% of the market, and D&D itself would be 70%, So anyway, I didn't really get involved with other publishers.
Okay.
And TSR, basically they just wanted some cash, and I think they wanted to exercise some editorial control to make sure it just didn't get too ridiculous. But frankly, they didn't exercise much. There was very little that they did to adjust or, fine tune, correct, whatever.
That infamous term at the time, Dungeons and Beavers.
I don't remember that.
Oh, okay. I remember reading somewhere Gary was complaining about in Caltech. They were playing D&D, but it was so out there that he called it Dungeons and Beavers.
Yeah. Well, and you can see why. I mean, we had a fairly rough and ready approach. They had a much more, their vision was for a more professionally published approach. And I can understand why. They had, the main market and everything. But we really felt that if we kept a fairly primitive, newsprint or bond paper type approach, people would feel free to just write all over it and make it theirs. Whereas, I had all these D&D books, but I never wrote in them. It didn't. It just were too nice to write in, and so I ended up selling. Back in a few years ago, about this time, all my D&D stuff, and they were going for like $800 and whatever, because they were pristine condition,
I got a copy of the Character Codex, and all it is like blanks. And I looked at it and I go, I could never write in this, even though you were supposed to put stuff in it.
Yeah, but when you pay a chunk of change for it,
Well, exactly.
But even at the day, I'd say. Sorry, Bill. What?
Oh, I was just going to say, Bob, always wanted everything to be very inexpensive, so it would be very accessible. And then that way, if a person were kind of like a obsessive, compulsive type person, like maybe I am, I could just buy 2 copies, for the price of one TSR product and write all over the one copy.
That's a good. Excuse me. That's a good idea. Now, I'm just going to briefly touch on this, but John was asking a question about, while most of the Judges Guild products were useful or classic, like Tegel Manor, Dark Tower, things like that. I don't know if you know this or not, because I think you left the company before that, but do you have any idea what the reasoning was behind publishing the Field Guide to Encounters?
No, I really don't.
Okay.
I mean, if there was some sort of, if it appeared to be more of a rule system type thing, which I assume from your question, Bob, did want to have kind of like a universal system, essentially, and I don't know that he ever fully published it. If he did, then it just shows how out of touch I am. But he was getting concerned, I guess, about whether D&D would continue to, give authority, and up until fairly recently, he was saying stuff like, they never had the right to be so pushy on the copyright as they did. I mean, that was the latest thinking. It was never tested, the copyright of D&D, as far as I know. So, we could have done whatever, and it didn't matter. I mean, obviously, you don't want to just publish, complete sections, but the idea that you couldn't use the term magic user or something, or
Yeah.
characteristics, that was pretty plain vanilla stuff.
Yeah. Okay. And Mike had one last question about City State.
Yeah. When I first got a copy of the City State and looked at it, one of the things that just kind of struck me was that the Overlord, the Invincible Overlord, was listed as lawful evil with good tendencies. And I don't know if you remember, but how did that work out in actual play to be evil with good tendencies? Do you remember?
No, and the sad thing is that I stopped playing fantasy games about the same time I started publishing fantasy games, okay? So it was Bob that really carried on, and like I said, Summerlot and a few others locally, and I don't know how to square that circle other than that Bob probably liked building in ambiguity that would suggest something to the referee, and that way, you could carry something forward. Whereas if he just said, okay, this is how you do it, he never felt comfortable with the idea of giving you kind of a step-by-step. He wanted to spark your creativity, not just replace it, So I don't know. It's ironic, but we never had a game that I was in, at least, in the City State. It was a product, not a... So Teagle Manor, I had a lot more feeling for because we'd actually played numerous games there, and it was an incredible place.
Now that's a fun game.
Yep.
That rocks, yeah.
Even if you're going through the back.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's clear the tower out first, because we're second level, and that'll be easier. Oh, yeah. That was ugly.
And you got to think about, the fun that we had of having Bob run this, who would, thunk it all up, And after he had died, Bob Jr. Said, you want to see a copy of Teagle Manor, and I thought he meant just the printed copy, and he actually showed me a framed, the original full-color graph paper version that Bob had done, and I was just stunned because Bob wasn't real good at keeping things at times, okay? I was the person who kept everything, and I had still had scroll spells that he had toasted with his cigarette and tea bags to make them look old, And he said sometimes he would draw some really beautiful thing, in the kitchen there, and then before the guys were coming for the game, and then he would turn on the burner to light a cigarette or something and burn up the entire artwork,
Oh.
Oh no, it's a real shame. But anyway, I had that stuff, and I managed to sell a lot of it because I just at some point had to move on. This stuff was not getting any better in the basement. It needed to go to people who would appreciate it. And when I realized there were people out there who actually kept up this stuff like an archive, I thought this makes much more sense than risking having it go to water damage or have to be thrown out by my daughter when I'm gone, this sort of thing. Because she wouldn't know what to do with it,
Were there anything else that you wanted to ask Bob while we're here?
Well, since you mentioned that, you never really played much in the, City State, out of all the things that you created, how many of the supplements actually did get played by all of you guys as opposed to just being products that you put out for sale?
You mean like playtesting, things like that?
Well, yeah, or just, campaign worlds that, they as the creators personally enjoyed as well as just selling them.
Well, actually, until after I had left Judges Guild, I didn't play anything. I was working like 80 hours a week, and there wasn't time for that. And, when you're working, it's sort of like they say when you work in an ice cream store or something, you get kind of sick of ice cream. Mm-hmm. Then that's really the situation I was in. Now, after I had left Judges Guild, I obviously had some pent-up interest to do a fantasy campaign, so I set it in Wales, medieval Wales, and South Wales to be precise. And I'm actually going to be planning a tour there shortly. That's my main job these days and has been since 1972, actually.
I was just going to ask you about that. What are you up to lately?
Well, I do group tours, and tourgrouppro.com is my business, and we do tour groups, and I've done software to help other people build their own group tours on the web rather than having to do it with a combination of spreadsheets and legal pads. And anyway, so we went to Wales, as I said, and I utilized a lot of stuff from JG at that point because I had, first ones off the press, copies that came off and were maybe had a smudge on them, let's say, and so they weren't saleable. Mm-hmm. And so I'd put those in my collection. I was too thrifty to take one that could be sold. And anyway, I used a lot of that stuff then, and we had a lot of fun. And then my friend, there was about 4 of us, basically, so 3 players, and I was the ref. And at one point, my friend got this girdle of giant strength. He put it on, and it was a girdle of femininity. And, this is still the late 70s, and it just wasn't the thing for average guys to want to be girls. And although one time at the travel agency, this guy called me up and said, I want to go to Amsterdam, and I'm going to be a man when I go over, but I'll be a female when I come back. I'm having a sex change operation. And I made the mistake of saying to him, well, how long are you going to be abroad?
But Ching,
yeah, he hung up on me. I didn't get to sell him the ticket, but anyway.
Well, what does that have to do with your travel?
Nothing really. But anyway, so my friend was just burnt out, and I think it was just a good time for the game to end. You might say it'd gone on for at least about a year, and so the game just sort of went the way of a lot of fantasy games. Poof.
Do you do any wargaming or historical?
Oh yeah, the historical miniatures and board games are things that I have still been doing ongoing, and I just sold the HO scale tanks that we used for GRT originally, and then Tractix later. I mean, in some ways, Tractix was a little like a forerunner, you might say, of the concept of individual fantasy game role-playing type things.
Right.
It's just that we had miniatures, obviously. And I also sold
Roco
some...
or Airfix?
They were mainly AHM Roco and Roscoff mini tanks and the little rubber figures, that you'd paint and then you'd touch them wrong and the paint jump off.
Yeah.
But anyway, guy bought them for about $775. There were 300 tanks. Many of them were scratch built, with adjustments and so on. And yeah, it sounds like a lot of money, but when you look at what things cost back in 1970 and worked the inflation forward, we probably actually lowered their value by 10% by painting them.
Wow.
So anyway, that's the way it goes. And then also, so I'm more into tiny scale, like 3 millimeter people. They're like 3 dimes high, and Command Decision and Volley and Bayonet in that scale, which are miniature games. Bob and I used to play a lot of Hitler's War, which was a grand strategic, World War II game, essentially.
I remember that.
Is that metagaming?
It was originally metagaming. They had a prettier board, but Avalon Hill did a newer version, which, I actually ended up playing, even though it was ugly. And, and a lot of my collection was financed by royalties from Judges Guild, and then I later sold a lot of it and got tens of thousands of dollars, to help build the software in India that I have, for sale now. Cool. But so the board games, I mean, Bob was ready to play anything, anytime. He was always just a gung-ho, great game player and good buddy of mine. And most of the board games I kept tended to be more multiplayer games so that we could get together, with other guys like Summerlot and Whitehead and so on. And so that's been my main interest at this point.
Well, Bill, I know we've kept you over a little, but thank you very much for giving us time to talk with us.
You're welcome.
And what was your business? It was a tour group.
Yeah, tourgrouppro.com.
Okay.
And if people want to get like a copy of that Teagle Manor in full color as it originally was, they could go to cafepress.com/Judges Guild. And Bob Jr. and I split the income from that still. That's something that his dad and I started at some point. Because Bob would come to me and say, they didn't put a hex grid on the Wilderlands. And I said, do these people not play games? I mean, what's wrong with them? And so, I mean, I was always pretty arrogant and, ornery about stuff like that. So I have to regret some of that. But anyway, so we would go and, try to figure out how to put a hex grid on there. And so I ended up drawing a hex grid for Bob that was 10-foot square. Not obviously printable by any known process, but the idea was that you could just draw on that whole world of 1-inch hexes. And I even numbered all the hexes individually.
Oh, wow.
Which you could figure out what's 144 times 144. That's how many hexes there were.
Too many hexes. That's what that.
But after about, doing that a little bit, I figured, well, there's a way to make a spreadsheet, put the numbers for each row on and then, paste them in there. And back then, you'd spend a few hours on something like that. You didn't have fast computers. You just sat and
with a ruler and you went for it.
Yep.
Well, like I said, thank you for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.
Before you leave,
yes.
Would it be too much to ask if you'd be willing to go to do something as a promo for it? Kind of like, hi, I'm Bill Owen of Judges Guild, and you're listening to Save or Die Podcast?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Whatever you want, as long as it doesn't involve travel to the North Pole.
Okay, we'll do this. We'll do this like Vince would do it. 3, 2, 1.
Okay, you can tell me again what you want me to say.
Well, just off the cuff, Bill Owen of Judges Guild. You're listening to Save or Die Podcast.
Okay, Save or Die Podcast, right? That's what you want me to say.
That's
okay. You guys know what you said. Okay. You ready?
3, 2, 1.
This is Bill Owen, originally from Judges Guild, and you're listening to Save or Die Podcast.
Thank you.
Excellent.
That would be great. That's going to sound great at the beginning of the show.
Okay.
That's right. I forget the show title sometime too. So.
What are we on? Yeah, that show.
I thought we were on the the WotC one. No, okay. Well, anyway, thank you again, Bill. And
yes, we really appreciate it.
Yes, it's been a really nice talk, and you have a good day.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
If you have any comments, please email saveordie@gmail.com or visit Save or Die at saveordie.info. Follow the cast on Facebook /Save or Die Podcast or follow them on Twitter @TheEvilDM.